Thank you everyone for joining in. As Carol said, I'm speaking this evening primarily about the China Zun Tower, but its development was influenced significantly by two other projects that I've worked on previously. The first on the right-hand side for Vincent Lo in Chongqing, a project that still isn't finished, but my first experience working with sort of Chinese planning office. Shortly thereafter, a project in a tower in Suzhou for Wharf, and then a couple of years later, China Zun. China Zun was last to start and almost first to finish. That's a story in and of itself. But I'll start talking about China Zun and then touch a little bit on the others. And so I think you'll see some similarity in the process. The tower sits at the center of a new CBD in Beijing. It's at 528 meters tall and the only building intended to be that height. It's developed by CITIC Group, which, like China Resources, was one of the early companies set up within China to help provide connectivity to the outside world, to bring in finance, energy, manufacturing, et cetera. So they've been tied to the central government for quite some time. They have, in addition to those other things, have a history in construction. The building second from the left was their headquarters building on the northeast of Beijing, near the embassy district. And they were involved during the Olympics with the National Stadium. And then obviously the biggest thing they've completed is the CITIC Tower. So some construction experience, but not a traditional commercial real estate developer. The project is quite dense. It's a plot ratio equivalent of 30, sitting on a very small site. The constructed floor area over 4 million square feet. The story of how it came to be is, I think, as interesting as the design of the tower itself. The site sits to the east of the Forbidden City, on the east of the Third Ring Road, on Chang'an Boulevard. And it's part of a master plan that was developed, I guess maybe discussion starting in the 90s, but this is a plan from early 2000s, looking at how to disperse density within the city of Beijing to help preserve the low-rise character of the city surrounding the Forbidden City. There were subsequently development pressures that came with the Olympics in 2008. A lot of development occurred in support of that venture. And I think there was a lot of concern that, that maybe it wasn't fully taking the character of the historic city into account, or how one deals with increased density and public infrastructure. So in order to preserve this low scale, increased density was proposed in a new central business district to the east of the Third Ring Road. One of the amazing things about a country like China or the city like Beijing is that one is able to suddenly determine that 3 subway lines can coincide around the site to bring people in, bus interchanges, and an enormous amount of infrastructure in an area of the city that was mostly industrial previously, but didn't have much new development, so it was essentially a clean slate. And being at the intersection of the Third Ring Road and Chang'an is a sort of major intersection. There's also a public green space initiative to provide a ribbon of green that ties the site together into a necklace of green space throughout the precinct. But the 9-parcel site that the CBD sits on its final design was configured through an open competition, and individual developers were able to submit designs for individual sites or for the overall master plan. But the competition stipulated that it was up to the planning committee to determine which building went where. And so rather than a traditional process, you were essentially proposing for something without any understanding of whether or not your scheme would end up on the site that you proposed for. These are two images that just show the density of the site in 2001 on the left, and the current, or just from last year, showing the change that has occurred. During that 2010 competition, we worked with Hong Kong Land on a sort of comprehensive plan for the entire development that was predicated essentially on a Rockefeller Center model. One of the dictates of the master plan was that there was a central park, a linear park, so that the site itself actually follows the sort of cross-axial planning of the Beijing city center itself. And this scheme was not successful, but the winning scheme was for this parcel was designed by BID and Terry Farrell's office, and was notable for its cross-section. And they argued that it bore similarity to a traditional Chinese vessel called Zun, which has a number of interesting connotations in its form. So if you think about this as a private commercial venture, the tallest building in the center of the city, the planners, the mayor, and I'm sure the premier found intriguing the idea that the tower was meant to represent a vessel that was communal and for everyone in the city. The form itself, their versions of the calligraphic writing of Zun, it's taken on many meanings over time. It also implies respect and a ritual offering. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is just, it seems maybe to Western eyes a little, or ears, a little odd to think that you're designing a building that looks like something that's not a building. And a lot of this just has to do with an idea about consensus building and finding some means of talking about a new idea that can gradually draw people in. One of the things that I learned early on when I was studying Mandarin that had not occurred to me, and this may be well known to all of you, but the Chinese written language is pictographic. And the character on the right is the current version of the word for house or home. But the early versions were a roof over a pig. And that idea of domestication implies family. And so one of the things that I came to understand was that any physical object that you can look at has a name, has an implication. When you're designing a building, unless you take some control over that, you're leaving your object open to interpretation. When CITIC won the competition, they, as I mentioned earlier, didn't really have any super high-rise experience. So they invited Wharf from Hong Kong to join them in partnership. And I had, starting in 2000 to 2010, worked with Wharf on the Whitlock Square in Shanghai. And so they invited us to be involved in the development of the project as the architect beyond the concept planning stage. And we spent easily a year working with them on schemes that maintained the waist of the tower, but Wharf was not thrilled by the curvilinear nature of the plan. So a number of these schemes looked at squaring it out. The version that we ended up with, we ultimately came to realize that once consensus had been achieved on that slightly rounded form with the tapered waist, it was almost impossible to deviate from that. And one of the common themes you'll hear is that while CITIC and Wharf were the client, half of decision-making came through the vice mayor's office and the planning department. The process of this tower, I mean, once you get beyond the idea that it's got a narrow waist and it's meant to represent a zun, is entirely parametric. One of the things that occurred during the process was that the city planners were wanted to be involved in the decision about where the pinch point of the tower was, because they wanted it to occur above the body of the surrounding tower so that you, a viewer, could understand the movement that was occurring, that it didn't appear to be just one direction. The tower itself, as we started, had office use at the base, a service apartment at the center with hotel, and then a crowning office, executive office at the top. One of the things that that tapered waist did for us, if you think about it conversely, it gave us a very broad base. So the tower of this height and complexity has 100 elevators. And you know that the simplistic diagram for elevatoring is essentially a pyramid that many of them drop out down below. And in a simply extruded tower, you're fighting minimum distances from core to perimeter at the base that are too small and maybe at the top that are too large. So our process here was one in which the design of the core influenced through planning depths, the shape of the perimeter, and all of this within a fixed height and a fixed amount of area. This was also clearly an engineering challenge. Beijing sits in seismic zone 8, which is the worst possible seismic zone one could build in, let alone a super tall building. And you know that tall buildings have varying responses over their height based on wind movement, and different program uses have different tolerances for movement. So one can tolerate more movement in an office setting than in a residential or hotel one. That's essentially the difference between sitting up and lying down. And so we worked with the engineers to understand where those non-office program elements would go and the impact that they would have on the stiffness that the building would need to achieve. At the end of the process, CITIC decided to develop an all-office building and eliminate those other uses. But again, a fairly parametric process to understand interior planning, height, location of waste, and all of this was reviewed regularly with the city. Most super high-rise buildings that are simply extruded follow a mega column scheme, 8 large columns that are tied together with belt trusses and outriggers through the core. And this is a very sort of structurally efficient and economic approach. ICC, Ping An towers that we've designed have all followed that model, but it's not one that is it works very efficiently in a seismic zone like Beijing, and what you really want is something that's more like the Eiffel Tower that spreads the structure at the base to establish as wide a stance as possible. So the solution that we ended up with is sort of a hybrid. It's a mega column scheme in the center, but as those columns come closer to the ground, they move further and further apart, and they essentially merge as 4 large columns at the base of the building. That gives us, if the waist of the building is 52 meters, this gives us a 72 meter width at the base of the tower. And you'll see as in a few slides further, it also helps enormously in the way the tower meets the ground and allows the ground plane to open up with those columns moved away from center. And the early schemes that had residential and hotel atop looked at sort of mini columns merged with the mega column diagonally braced scheme. That's the one that, no matter what the program use was, ultimately was determined to be the most efficient. And here, the final structural model, the design process, every time we changed our Rhino model to move the location of the waist or to change the dimension from core to perimeter, Arup Luping and his team had to adjust the structural model. So that was a fairly close collaboration from the very early concept designs all the way through production in order to optimize the structure and the building massing. They, because of the seismic zone, they were required to build a 1:40 scale model of the tower at the China Academy of Building Research for a shaping table test where they simulate ground movement and then record it through sensors. And the results of the test proved to be similar to the dynamic model, the computer-based model that Arup had been using, so that allowed the process to move forward. We also, as you know, did a lot of wind tunnel testing. The round form, while it is wider at the roof, does perform fairly well in the wind just by virtue of the curvilinear nature of the corners. The site is really not much larger than the tower. Footprint itself, if you subtract the surrounding roadways, you only have space for the tower. Part of the sitting between the axial park and the tower is a civic center. We did some early designs for that. It was ultimately developed by, I think, Kurokawa's office, that basically follows the same premise, that the axis of the park opens through to the tower with the civic uses to either side, the tower coming simply to the ground. This is the ground plane that shows those columns moving to the corners so that between them there's no impediment to movement physically. And then the core, essentially 11 bays by 11 bays. The outer ring of elevators are mostly for office and residual uses, so they drop off at the base of the building, so the narrower tower continues. But while much of the discussion about this tower with the government was what it looked like on the skyline, I was really concerned about how it met the ground and how one might mediate a building of this scale and magnitude on what are really finely grained streets. And the premise then was to, rather than let it come into the ground like Excalibur thrust into the earth, was to allow the form to levitate above the ground by folding the curtain wall out. That served the purpose of also allowing a drop-off canopy to be integrated into the design of the tower rather than being something additive. And here you'll see the way those columns pull to the corners. The line of glazing with the tension cable system really allows that line of enclosure to dematerialize, and the inside flows right to the outside. That canopy then integrates gutters and lighting and actually served quite a few useful purposes. This is the view where the canopy sweeps up and meets the one of the four columns. You see a little bit of CCTV there in the center, that's right across the street. And then the entry through the glazed wall to the lobby. The lobby merges the vertical wall of the core with the ceiling, and actually takes that surface as a screen out and connects it to the canopy, the line of curtain wall glazing that comes down from above. So there's one sort of sinuous line from top of tower to edge of canopy and back into the ground floor. There's the detail where the ceiling goes from being solid to screen. And even the rods that make up that ceiling follow the plan form of the tower. So there's sort of synergy between detail and overall mass. This is one of my favorite photographs of the building, which is where the edge of the tower comes down very close to the ground. And by establishing that tension, I think it helps the building feel like it's floating more. And it also, at least from the exterior, removes any sense of massivity from those four columns that come down at the corners. Then a view from the inside looking back out. The concourse levels, the parking, the retail for all of these development sites were combined and in fact constructed all at the same time. There's a subterranean retail concourse that coincides with the level that the public transportation exits on. And the overall, the sort of comprehensive plan even has separate entries for trucks that sort of much like Wacker Drive in Chicago, where there's a whole subterranean level that allows servicing to be separate from the public functions. And this rendering of the B1 level, where you come in from the subway to the lower deck of the double deck elevator cabs that go to the sky lobby levels. And then a view looking from below. The office space has obviously the four big columns, but the exterior module is based on an interior office planning module. Here you'll see the plan as the lower saddlebag lifts drop off with the mega columns at the corners, an enormous core here at the base. One of the challenges with the project was to figure out how to efficiently deal with the changing perimeter dimension of the tower at every floor. The version that we settled on was one that basically subdivided every floor the same number of times. So at the corners, the mullions are angled. The wide piers give some added density to the tower, so it's not entirely glass, and help, in my mind, it helps accentuate the reading of the waste. Those piers then also allow office participants some flexibility as they connect from the interior, and also provided opportunity for LED lighting, which occurs where that cover meets the line of glazing. While the tower was under construction, the vice mayor's office contacted CITIC and said, you have to redesign the top of your tower because it looks too Western. It should look more Chinese. Maybe it should even look like a traditional pagoda roof. This is after the tower had been approved, but apparently some overview of new construction proposed or recently completed in Beijing gave local officials a concern that maybe the buildings being built were still feeling a little too Western and not taking on enough of a local character. And so we spent easily 4 months fighting against building a 3-tiered roof on top of the building. And there are cautionary tales around Beijing where the architect decided not to follow the government's request, and the government hired another architect to redesign the top of the building. The scheme that we were able to convince them followed lines of a traditional Chinese roof is the scheme on the right-hand side. And I think it was actually a fortuitous request. The early design had a flat roof based on that early competition entry, and because that was flat at the time, there was really no way to think about changing it. No one was interested in that. But the final version allows there to be some synergy between the way the tower meets the sky and the way the form of the exterior wall meets the ground. And then here you see it at a little more of a distance. There, the ultimate articulation at the top of the building. And here, a photograph from the Forbidden City that shows the way that the top, which is essentially a cut made by a sphere into the form of the tower to yield that form, follows the curve of traditional Chinese architecture. So, if you think about the first super tall in Shanghai, Jinmao, it was maybe obvious to follow the multi-tiered steps of many of the tall pagoda forms that exist around China. This is sort of another step in the evolution of trying to understand how one can draw cultural parallels or synergies without having to directly copy past models. At the very top of the building, when all of the office cores drop off, there is a public observation deck. And this is a rendering. It's still not complete, and there were security concerns that his privacy or the privacy of others might be jeopardized. So fortunately, the building had been topped out, the vice mayor's office called again and said that the building had to be reduced in height. And that was a way to eliminate the observation deck from the top of the tower. A compromise was reached where, because it was already built, it was allowed to be maintained, just not occupied. So I don't know where that discussion exists at the moment, but currently there is this remarkable space waiting at the top of the tower to allow the public to come up and sort of realize the communal potential of the building. But I mean, remarkable view when you can see through the atmosphere. The next project I'd like to talk about was designed for Vincent Lo Shui On in Chongqing, starting in 2007. And he had, as you know, he was remarkably successful with the development of Shenzhen in downtown Shanghai, which brought in public open space, new residential, preserved historic buildings, and new commercial development. And that was really the first that anyone had seen anything like that in China, and it became the model for much development beyond that. And he was invited to Chongqing to develop a riverfront site. Chongqing, the city in Western China where the Yangtze River meets the Jiaolin River. And it's a city that is known historically for its maritime commerce. The site that they were given to develop was west of the confluence of the rivers. I think it may have been an old army base site, but linear along the river. And SOM developed a beautiful master plan that established a lake, retail complex that was based on historic precedents and materiality, residential precincts, and then the commercial development was indicated in red on the plan. And in SOM's scheme, there was a singular tower facing the water, and it was the only direction we were given when we were hired to start doing the design work was that the main tower was called the reflection of the sail in the Jiaolin River. So a little tying into the idea of the maritime history, and the solution that we ultimately moved forward with was one that picked up on sail forms and used, rather than the idea of catching the wind, designing a tower that would work well in a wind tunnel to make the structure as efficient as possible. And the tapering of the tower also worked well with the program that was to be applied, the tall tower office below with a hotel above. View, there's a retail podium connecting to a light rail system that did not exist at the time of the project. Has just been completed now, 13 years later. And we took this through. There's public open space at grade, gathering spaces, and one of the other requests of the government, once the form of the towers were decided, was that the curtain wall should somehow represent the character for double happiness. Apparently there's a homonym between double happiness in Chongqing, and this became completely non-negotiable, that the mayor and Vincent dictated that the curtain wall should have this unique character. So the one that we ultimately employed essentially just packaged the facade in modules that generated a shear line every 4 floors. This actually helped us in dealing with a tower that's curving in plan and section simultaneously. So the same module employed from a center point in each of those zones, and then it gets mapped out to the edges where it's cut. This is the first tower, the shorter of the 3, that was completed, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. And at that point, there was, when Vincent started, he was the only new development. By the time the first tower was complete, there was a lot more development. The market had essentially tanked, and the project was mothballed with the structure for the main tower and the podium built up to the 5th floor. And it sat there for 5 years until 2 years ago, when the project was majority share was sold to Vanke, and we've been working with them, completing the project. So by the end of this year, the super tower and its cladding will be complete, bringing the project to completion. But even so, while the project is still under construction, we're now looking at redesigning the top of the tower for an outdoor observation deck. You know, what was cutting edge for a super tall tower in 2007 pales in comparison to offerings today. So the design work still goes on. The third tower is in Suzhou for Wharf. It sits in the middle of a development on the east side of the East Lake in what's known as the Suzhou Singapore Industrial Park, which I think was initiated in the early 2000s between Singapore and China as a sort of port of entry to facilitate international business. And it also provided a way for commercial development to occur in the city without compromising the scale of the historic city. The site has, the master plan is also based on canals and emerging of high-rise and low-rise development. And Wharf was, was interested in purchasing land on the south side of the lake for landed residential development. And as part of the deal, they were asked to design and build a 500-meter supertall in exchange for the right to be able to build the residential. So that's what they took on. There was some development nearby. This is a view looking back. This was from the time we started the project, very little density there, looking back across the lake, which is quite sizable to the old city. There is a building on the west side of the lake that is locally called the Pants Building. And the one design requirement was that our development site, our tower, should have some sort of synergy with that tower. And other than the area given and the height, there was very little direction given by the Planning Bureau. And our scheme utilized, again, a tapered section to move away from just a simply extruded tower. This idea about sort of designing the tower as much from the inside out as the outside in. And we'd also developed, it became a linear scheme. Our goal was to develop some frontality back to the old city. And that also at the time manifests itself in multi-story sky gardens that had little microcosm versions of the gardens that make up historic Suzhou. There was also an idea about taking the green from the ground plane. There was an green observation deck at the roof. We thought this was a fantastic scheme. This was the rendering that we presented to the city planners, and they decided that it wasn't iconic enough. And maybe they were concerned that when seen from a distance, it didn't look that dissimilar from a simply extruded tower. So after a year's worth of work and negotiations, well, I guess maybe it was 6 months, we were asked to go back and start over. So again, the owner doesn't really have any say at this point over what the building, what the approved design looks like. It lies in the hand of the public authorities. And one can, I think at some level it's admirable, someone acting as a watchdog looking out for the public's best interest. But I think it also has to do with someone making the effort to allow the building that is going to represent the city on the world stage of super high-rise, that there's some message being disseminated that's consistent with their version or vision of themselves. The schemes that we looked at subsequently went back to sort of center core, more traditional center core schemes. The one that we landed on the far right sort of hit the mark because by tapering the tower at the top, it essentially gives us a fifth facade looking back towards the historic city. And the program for the tower, as we were designing it, was had hotel at the top. So if you think about the atrium that's created at the top of ICC, when the office cores drop off, that space is entirely internalized. It's got a skylight above. But here, by slicing the top of the tower, we're able to open that atrium and to give views back towards the water, back towards the historic city. We also, there was no, given the tower's location, the client didn't perceive a need or a value of building retail on the site. So the tower was essentially coming down again as a singular obelisk. The brief of the tower, office, service apartment, hotel, migrated at one point to providing two different typologies of apartment, and the tail that was generated from the scheme not only helped mediate this and the scale of the context, tied the building into those buildings that existed, but also gave a way to introduce a different program type and to subdivide the site for differential drop-offs. So the final biology of the tower here, with double-loaded residential in the tail that you see on the lower right, and then larger units on the upper right in a ring corridor around the core. There, the purple plan on the left at 89 shows the atrium looking back out through the cut. At the time, with this sinuous form, we also proposed to the city that we could think of this building like a carp. The carp is auspicious. The idea of the fish and water in Suzhou seemed appropriate. And this, well, I think the design won the day, but that symbol sort of gave everyone an understanding, a more sort of tangible idea, a way to think about the tower, in addition to the design that we were proposing. It's, again, when you present this and you show an image like this, the intention was not to design a tower that looked like a fish, but given this sort of pictographic understanding of the world, this was sort of synergistic and allowed us the scheme to be approved. Structurally, it's a simple mega column scheme. It's actually only, while the city asked it to be built at 500 meters in height, it was completed at 450. At one point, because of the sort of long construction cycle, the client decided that there was no market for hotel and the residential market was overbuilt. So we redesigned the section of the tower to be designed entirely as office, with a sky lobby at the midpoint for elevatoring, all the floor-to-floor heights moving to 4.5 meters from the lower floor-to-floor heights that the residential had. And this stood, actually the tower started construction. It was formally approved with this structure. And then the client decided that the market for hotel and residential had come back. And we were able to, I mean, maybe it's an inefficient way to provide flexibility, but in the subsequent design exercises, because the elevatoring, the core had been designed for the greatest possible population density, and the ceiling heights had been designed for office, we were able to move the hotel and residential around in multiple configurations. I mean, it's like a high-rise version of a loft building that, through its structure, gives you some flexibility in how you use the space. And here is the completed tower seen from the canal leading out to the lake, and the tower on the skyline looking back. So those are my slides of the towers. I do have a video of China Zun that I would like to share with you. Let's see if we can make this work. One of the things that I forgot to mention, one of the decisions that CITIC made was to hire the gentleman who'd been responsible for building Shanghai World Financial Center and made him project manager for the entire project. So it was, I think the reason that it went so quickly was based on his previous knowledge, and also I think with the support of the central government. But you know, that tower had the focus of the city planners as the only super tall that was meant to be built in Beijing, and everyone wanted to see it succeed. But I hope that the projects that I've shown give you some understanding about the sort of three-headed nature of the design process working in China between architect, developer, and planner that may be a little different from what people are used to experiencing.
Thank you, Rob, for just a really spectacular talk and so many insights into the process of development in China, as well as the details of getting from such a master plan overview down to the smallest details of mullions and kind of shifting kinds of attention to how the smallest parts relate to the whole. And I just have to add that I was particularly interested in the pictographic understanding of the world idea that you gave us, because it really does, I think, help to understand the attachment to a kind of narrative vision, which we in the West think of as narrative, as a story, but thinking it in terms of pictograph also as a different way of really visualizing the world for a different culture, I think is a really important idea to add to that question that I'd never thought of before. But in my questions, let me begin by pressing you a little bit more about the relationships of the commercial developers and then the government award for a site, and then the government regulation that might come from a different direction of a kind of more bureaucratic input into the design process. So CITIC is a headquarters, mostly occupied by this extraordinarily large asset company. And that's quite different than a developer who comes from Hong Kong and understands the speculative market and how to think and respond to the various conditions of the economics of the moment and the kind of mix that he wants to pursue. Can you talk, illuminate a little bit more about how those different kinds of clients and developers affect your work and the design and decision making?
I think, as you can see from several of those projects, and most super talls that we've been involved in, the finished project transcends economic cycles. And Shanghai World Financial Center changed size after a dip in a cycle, and you essentially try to look through the crystal ball to figure out what you think is going to sell best in the future. For, I think, CITIC, the reason, I don't think that they felt that there was a market for that sort of residential, or that you could sell it in a way that would make sense to them. They are an enormous organization and had headquarters in many, many buildings around Beijing, and decided to culminate and to bring all of their people together in one place. They don't occupy the entire building. Alibaba has 2 zones. And it seems entirely possible to me that, in the future, some of those other zones may be let out to other people. But completing that much, 4 million square feet of space and having it all come online simultaneously, you're not going to lease that floor by floor. So it's, you might even think of it as a sort of interim step, a way to back out of other leases, leave other buildings behind, fully occupy the building, and then it'll take on a life of its own the approvals process, I think there is a large amount of integration between the building department and the planning department. And I didn't feel working on CITIC at any time, except for when the vice mayor picked up the phone and called to say, you have to change the design. There was nothing about the building regulations that got in the way of achieving the original concept design. It was, for a building at that height in this location, the primary concern, of course, was structure, making sure that it was a viable scheme, life safety systems, and all of those other things that come along with super tall buildings. One of the things that one frequently encounters in China is that the code changes midway through the process, and the building has got to modify itself, especially if the project has gone on hold, and suddenly a new code has come into place about fire compartment size or number of egress stairs or other issues. The pace at which codes are developing, whether you would say that they're westernizing, they're becoming more intelligent, but the rapidity with which they change is really the greatest challenge, not disconnects between planners and building departments, at least in my experience.
Mm. Well, speaking of codes and responding to those local conditions or changes, have there been any earthquakes in Beijing since the towers?
I don't know the answer to that.
A lot of people I know ask me, and I have absolutely no idea the correct answer to this question, about the Chinese institutes and how the American architects, who have been over the last 20 years, so dominant in the design field of winning the commissions and kind of owning the image of Western expertise. To the extent that there was even some political press back about too many Western architects playing out on Chinese city skylines. Can you describe a little bit about the relationship of working with the institutes of design or the engineering institutes, and do you think, of course, the question is always asked, are the Chinese professionals simply trying to understand so they can take over and operate, completely autonomously?
Well, the best way to think about the design institutes is they're essentially communal architectural practices, and some of them have closer ties to universities. Some are are several that focus primarily on infrastructure and airports. And they do an enormous amount of work, often without only marginal, maybe concept design work from an international firm. But they're sort of large hierarchical organizations. They're very good typically at what they do. The reason that Western architects seem to get a toehold is that we are bringing our super high-rise experience from the West. I mean, so we already have knowledge about how these buildings behave. And so we're hitting the ground running rather than doing it for the first time. I mean, obviously what the methodologies that we brought to China, that all of us brought to China when we first started working, pale in comparison to what has evolved working in China with the design institutes, with Chinese engineers, that in a way that's completely transformed the building type. But it is that level of experience beforehand that I think gives us the leg up. Certainly at this point, BID, who we worked with on China Zun, they were the lead architect for the concept design phase and had very interesting ideas. Their original proposal was for a diagrid system, which I think it sort of worked with the tower form. Les Robertson, may he rest in peace, when he started working with us at the very beginning of the project, said, you couldn't possibly find a more inefficient way to design structure for a building of that height in Beijing. And it was just his understanding of buildings of that scale and that seismic zone. I was, Scott's presentation several weeks ago talked about the taxonomy of tall building and structural typologies that SOM has worked on over the years. And, there's just, again, a leg up in thinking on how you approach these projects.
Mm. Someone has asked about this curiosity about the city planners and just how much role they have in decisions about, well, the specific question was about materials. I mean, at what level are they able to assert their preferences in the design?
For the most part, materiality is today in China governed primarily in ratios of glazing on facades, sometimes masquerading as environmental efficiency, as solidity versus glazing. But there are some places where, and again, China varies city by city, and in some cases district by district, trying to prevent glare from buildings. We've worked, one of the projects that I've been working on in Shanghai, Dongjidu, has a maximum reflectivity of 9%, which is less than the reflectivity of uncoated glass. It has the unfortunate effect in dull weather of making the building look black. It sort of looks like the CBS building on 6th Avenue. We took it upon ourselves to introduce a fair amount of solidity in the form of a sort of broad white terracotta or painted aluminum panels to give the building some brightness and some scale. But it's not something that the planners at this point are able to dictate, other than that if they, working in Wuhan recently, they're part of the development is meant to resemble sort of Shintendi scale pedestrian lane-like cityscape. So there is a dictate that the buildings be masonry and in some way tie into traditional materiality of the city. So, what my experience has been that dictate typically occurs on smaller scale buildings, and super talls are primarily about glazing percentages.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask one more question from the audience, because we're a little bit over our time. Someone was as surprised as I was about how many change orders, in effect, change of program there are in the process of a well-advanced scheme. And so someone was particularly concerned about how much does that cost in order to make all of those changes? And why did they absorb that cost?
Well, again, a lot of the shifting of the program elements in Z15 was just trying to find a way to optimize the form of the building. And a lot of that occurred during the schematic design phase. And so it was part of standard development. In the case of Wharf's project in Suzhou, that all of those changes occurred after the building had been approved by where they had a construction permit. And that was their attempt to optimize their commercial investment. And so we were paid additional services to do that. Meager, I'm sure, but it covered our costs, and it was a service well provided to allow the building to perform at a higher level.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that very real world note about how tall buildings become realized, I think because we are over our time that we should conclude for this evening. And I thank everybody for coming, and I urge you to come back next week when Carl Fender will talk about the KL project, the Merdeka 118. And to join us for all the other sessions. But tonight, thank you so much, Rob, for just really a spectacular presentation and such a a vast amount of experience that you've had in projects over a couple of decades already. I mean, you've really shared the insider's look and how it feels to be there at every stage of the operation. So thank you so much for helping us to understand that, as well as for the buildings that you created. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you all for watching.
Take care. Good night. Welcome to the fourth of our talks in Worldview, Designing Global Supertalls. And we're going to be back in China again to see, well, at least 3 of the supertalls that Rob Whitlock, our speaker tonight, a principal and a designer, principal and a partner at KPF for nearly 30 years. And these are 3 buildings that he'll talk about in some detail that he's worked on over the last more than a decade. I want to, you can see on the screen a little bit of a description of Rob's career at KPF and also a picture of the main event for our lecture tonight, the China Zun, or the CITIC Tower in Beijing, the tallest building on the Beijing skyline at 528 meters. I will speak for just a few minutes and show you a couple more slides in order to introduce the series if this is the first time you've joined us. The idea really of this series is of Worldview is to have a bit of a travelogue, stopping at the places both global cities of great renown like New York and Shanghai and Hong Kong, that is of skyscraper renown, and we'll be going to the Middle East in a couple of weeks. But also to go to the cities that are not so well known, to really kind of expand outside of our Zoom boxes and to break the bounds, the bonds of our confinement in order to find out what's been going on around the world without being able to travel there directly. So Worldview, Designing Global Supertalls has so far taken us, in the next screen that I show you, with Jamie von Klemper, and if we start on the left with Shenzhen and the China Resources Tower. We've been to Guian with Scott Duncan, and just last week in Tianjin with Brian Lee of SOM. And now we've worked our way about halfway through our list of supertalls, and I wanted to preview and invite you to come next week when Carl Fender, a Melbourne-based Australian architect who has designed the Merdeka 118 in Kuala Lumpur. We'll talk about that design, which is just about to top out, but I think isn't that well known in the West. And then he's followed the next week by Adrian Smith, who is the designer of multiple, I think something like 8 super talls, including the world's tallest, the Burj Khalifa. And then you see a couple more towers still yet to come in our 12 lecture series. The schedule you can find on our website, and you see it here. And we're beginning now to get to, well, halfway, a little more than halfway through of our list of focusing on the architects, the principal designers who have led the teams and created the forms of these towers. And the second half of the series really focuses on engineering. So we kind of look both back and broadly at lessons learned, at the technologies invented and then expanded, especially in structural engineering in the second part of the series. So we really are hoping to explore broadly the topic of the typology of the 21st century super tall and begin to probe some of these characteristics that go across time, and that across time is now about 30 years worth of span. And Rob Whitlock's career at KPF, going back to his tower, has spent a great deal of his time working in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And we were just speaking before we began it, some of the places that KPF began to make their connections to what has become over the last 25 years or so an extraordinary number of projects, not just super tall towers, but whole mixed-use developments in many cities throughout China, in Singapore, and many other places around the world. But Rob has been particularly connected to a number of these Chinese projects and also master plans. He has also, and he will speak about tonight, been the principal designer for these two other extraordinary super talls, one in Suzhou, another in Chongqing, and he'll show us a little bit about those. And he's had in these three projects that he'll particularly focus on tonight, an extraordinary amount of experience in working with Chinese government and especially with developers, both Chinese and Hong Kong developers. So I asked him in particular to help us to understand the development dynamic in China and how the architect and the team led by the architects works with the developers, works with the government in order to realize projects. These are particularly complex projects in general, but sometimes the negotiations in getting to the final design is a process that seems very foreign to the American context. And I don't want to neglect to mention that Rob doesn't work only in China, because he's been now one of the image makers of the new New York skyline, being the principal architect of two, they're not super talls by our definition at the museum, but very tall and slender towers, residential in Lower Manhattan. There's 111 Murray Street. And on my street, on 22nd Street, on the east side, Madison Square Tower, another very slender building that rises some 800 feet. He's also the lead designer of a new project that has just been announced, and he won't be talking about the New York projects tonight, but I just wanted to mention that the 5 World Trade Center site development, which has been announced as mixed use, but principally residential, is also on his desk and a KPF project. So there's an extraordinary amount of work, and surprisingly, once again, here in New York, as the last 20 years or so, KPF has really put its mark on the skyline of many Chinese cities. So I'm going to ask Rob to come onto to the screen now with his camera, and then I will go off and he'll take over with his presentation. But before I leave, I just want to mention that if you have questions for the chat, which I'm going to moderate, please add them to the chat, type them into the chat box. And during the talk, I'm going to be listening, or I'm going to be watching for the questions, which I will moderate by combining and selecting the questions that we'll be able to address in probably the last about 10 minutes or so of the program. So please direct your chats to me. And then I will pose them to Rob later. So Rob, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Carol.